Welcome, my name is Justin Davis, and this paper is titled Kierkegaard, Climacus, COVID, and Isolation. Borrowing a quote from Solzhenitsyn's Templeton Address, Dostoevsky warned us that great events could come upon us and catch us intellectually unprepared. This is precisely what has happened. This has happened many times over the course of our history. Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn applied this to the Bolshevik coup and the Russian Revolution. Kierkegaard would have applied this to the Revolution of 1848, and many of us today would apply this to the COVID pandemic. We find ourselves intellectually unprepared for what is upon us, and yet we can learn from others how to venture going forward. Revolutions and pandemics have a lot in common. Both turn our world upside down and require that we adjust immediately. Both result in us adjusting to a new normal, that dreaded phrase. Both, at least in the short term, make our lives more difficult. Difficulty, of course, should bring us back to Kierkegaard, whose theological mission was to make Christianity more difficult. The main way he did this was by calling the individual to account before God on their own. In Kierkegaard's eyes, both the Revolution of 1848 and the growth of power in the Danish Church sought to make Christianity easy by making it a corporate act. Kierkegaard maintains that the corporatization did not bring community, but isolation for the individual. Yet, for many, the lack of a unifying corporate structure also serves to isolate the individual from both their neighbor and their God. In this paper, I highlight the relationship between Kierkegaard and the inspiration for his pseudonym Johannes Climacus, Saint John of the Ladder. I will apply their views of isolation and solitude in light of the global COVID-19 pandemic. Great events came upon Denmark in the 19th century. Kierkegaard's life witnessed a major shift in the public sphere of Copenhagen. The city was outgrowing its walls and shifting from a small market military harbor town into a large European urban center, with all of the challenges and opportunities thereof. This included both the extremes of alienation and modern recreation. Tivoli Garden, the famed amusement park, opened in 1843, and the ticket sales represent nearly a third of the country's population. The city's transformation demonstrates a shift into an aesthetic sphere, which is central to Kierkegaard's writing and treatments of crowds, isolation, and modernity. Kierkegaard cultivated a distaste for the growing modern city itself. The water was called a lukewarm eel soup because of its poor quality, and Kierkegaard lamented, "The present age is essentially a sensible, reflecting age, devoid of passion, flaring up in short-lived enthusiasm and prudently relaxing into indolence." The root of Kierkegaard's critique of the city was not the water nor the short-lived enthusiasm, but the lack of accountability for most people. Indeed, there were many things that Kierkegaard enjoyed about his modern life, many of which we appreciate as well. Soren Kierkegaard loved to smoke cigars and eat fine foods such as stuffed lamb, wine, and coffee. He lived in luxury apartments with exquisite furniture and filled them with books. He also loved to spend his money on music and the theater. His lavish home on Natrov served as a cultural center where debates occurred, including the plot of the common people. And his time in the theater served as an example for Christian transformation apart from culture itself, as we see in The Crisis and the Crisis in the Life of an Actress. Kierkegaard's luxurious life was much more in line with a wealthy aristocrat and less so for the malleable nature of the mobs that flocked to Tivoli and Deer Park. The malleable nature of the mobs is what Kierkegaard opposed. They allowed for the press to become unaccountable for the destruction of culture. For Kierkegaard, the mob takes many forms, including the crowd, the public, democracy, and true isolation. In Two Ages, Kierkegaard addresses the pitfalls of the public and the modern world. The public, he says, is a concept that simply could not have appeared in antiquity because the people were obliged to come forward en masse in the simulation of action, were obliged to bear the responsibility for what was done by individuals in their midst. Only when there is no strong communal life to give substance to the correction will the press create this abstraction, the public, made up of unsubstantial individuals who are never united, nor never can be united in the simultaneity of any situation or organization, and yet are claimed to be a whole. The public is a new phenomenon, a modern phenomenon. The public is a kind of colossal something, an abstract void and a vacuum that is all and nothing. There are no people who belong to the public. There is only a group of disconnected individuals who collectively move towards isolation and alienation. Individuals no longer engage one another on the street and in each other's homes, addressing the issues that really matter to them. Modernity is not a church or a congregation. It's not even a nation. It is only secluded, isolated characters who embrace an opinion that is foreign to them under the assumption that others are doing the same thing. The result is only further isolation for both God and their neighbor. To support this idea, Kierkegaard advanced the notion that the majority of people simply held no opinions. And the journalists make their livings by convincing the people that they have one. People are so easily swayed that as soon as it is discovered that someone does not have black buttons on his coat as the others do, then all other men laugh at him. And in Denmark, this laughter is called irony. This lack of fundamental thought is what led Kierkegaard to define the crowd as untruth. There is no more depth for the individual whose mind is now dominated by the banality of other men's false concerns. These concerns are nearly always in the aesthetic rather than the ethical or religious spheres of existence. One cannot transcend the mediocrity of the modern age if their life is formed by the press and not through individual introspection. For Kierkegaard, God is to be found in reflection, a reflection that requires moments of quiet seclusion, not simple isolation from others. And for self-examination, Kierkegaard maintains that the first thing, the unconditional condition for anything to be done, consequently, the very first thing that must be done is create silence. Bring about silence. The solution to the anonymous isolation we get when we form the mob is not only to move from the aesthetic to the ethical and finally to the religious sphere, but to seclude ourselves and become alone with our own thoughts and our God. To do this, one must create silence. In this light, we can see Kierkegaard's lavish spending not only as him living the life of an extravagant aristocrat, but rather it was used to create a cloister, to become a monastic. Being a Lutheran would have made such a creation rather difficult, so Kierkegaard used his wealth to seclude himself as an unordained monastic, though without the benefit of a monastery or a community of other lay monks. Kierkegaard's monastery was his home in the burgeoning city, and his long, expensive carriage rides, which he called air baths. His fellow monks were others that he encountered, to whom he related as individuals and not simply as members of the crowd. Many of Kierkegaard's fellow monastics were those famed monks from antiquity, those philosophers and theologians that he encountered in his library, one of which I want to highlight today is Saint John of Sinai, or more commonly known as Saint John of the Ladder, or Climacus, the inspiration for Kierkegaard's pseudonym Johannes Climacus. The real Saint John of the Ladder lived 579 to 649. He lived at the zenith of the later Roman Empire. Justinian's reign ended in 565, but by the end of the 7th century we see the loss of 3 of the seats of Christianity, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. There is almost no information about St. John's origin, though he was likely born in Constantinople. When he was 16 years of age, he went to St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai and became a monk. When the abbot that he was learning from died, John went further into the desert and settled in Thola, a wild place, where he will then spend the next 40 years in seclusion, prayer, and repentance. Key to this period of his life were the notions of tears of penance. It may be the emphasis of seclusion that attracted Kierkegaard to St. John, but even in this seclusion, St. John was not isolated from his fellow monastics at St. Catherine's. He was a part of a community who all strived together. After 40 years of solitary asceticism, he was chosen as the igumen, or the abbot of Sinai, when he was about 75 years of age. St. John governed the holy monastery for the next 4 years. It was here that he was requested to write a guide for those entering monastic life. While he felt unworthy of such a task, he submitted and wrote The Ladder of Divine Ascent. This is why he is called St. John of the Ladder. The ladder of divine ascent consists of 30 steps, or rungs of a ladder, leading to spiritual perfection. 30 is chosen to equal the number of years in Christ's life. Step 1 is complete renunciation of the world, the logical first step for any monastic, though likely a step too much for any of us. In step 30, we finally arrive at faith, hope, and love. The intervening 28 steps address the various passions that attempt to spoil the monastic's journey to union with God and the relationships with those around him. The work quickly grew beyond St. Catherine's monastery and became adopted by other monastics, and before too long was read by other clergy and ultimately the laity as well. St. John and his work became staples of Orthodox Christianity over Lent. The fourth Sunday of Lent is dedicated to him, and many lay Orthodox Christians even read the latter throughout the 7 weeks of Great Lent. It is also one of the first books to be printed with the use of the printing press. The icon, usually associated with St. John of the Ladder, shows monks and priests ascending the ladder to union with God. They are being pulled down by demons through the aids of the passions. They are also, though, being encouraged by the heavenly hosts. This encouragement is a central point for Orthodox Christianity in general, and St. John specifically. The corporate structure of the church is where salvation is to be found and lived out. Even the strict monastics at St. Catherine's viewed their fellow monastics as instrumental in their own life of prayer and union with God. Hesychists seek to rest the passions in their own life, but also to do this in service of love towards their neighbor and in community with those around them. What hesychists like St. John are aiming for is a concept known as theosis, or ultimate rest in God, which allows for the Christian to partake of God's love through God's energies and to become like God in the process. A concept that Kierkegaard makes reference to in the opening of chapter 3 in the concept of anxiety, and in his journals, where he will borrow from Barlaam of Calabria in his criticism of hesychists as amphilosochoi, an idea that Kierkegaard finds dangerous. So why would we link these two men together? What does the 6th century monk have to do with the 19th century Dane, who at least at first blush finds the central idea of the monk's spiritual exercises to be dangerous? What links these men? Well, for those who are familiar with Kierkegaard, he does. Kierkegaard uses the name of St. John for several of his works, more than any other pseudonym, especially if we include Anti-Climacus in that. It is the only pseudonym based upon a real person, unless, of course, we take SK and S. Kierkegaard to be pseudonyms as well, as we read in the point of view as an author. He says, as Kierkegaard, this is my limitation, that I am a pseudonym. So why did he pick St. John of the Ladder, and why did he use his name for these works? It could simply be that he liked the metaphor, the ladder of divine ascent, as we read in Johannes Climacus, the quote, fictionalized story of the 19th century anti-Hegelian aspiring philosopher, that it was a delight to begin with a single thought, and then by way of coherent thinking to climb step by step to a higher one, because to him coherent thinking was a ladder of paradise. The metaphor has real value for Kierkegaard, who also wrote that he counts himself higher than Johannes Climacus, but lower than Anti-Climacus. We too can't delight in a single thought and arrive, if not in paradise, at least in a greater point of understanding for ourselves. To return again to Solzhenitsyn and Dostoevsky, great events could come upon us and catch us intellectually unprepared. Instead of climbing the ladder of our understanding, we have indeed fallen unprepared for what has come our way. We have all experienced this with COVID. We were unprepared intellectually to what this virus could do to our jobs, our friendships, family, countries, and how one small thing could upset the entire world. COVID has cost us a lot. The World Economic Forum has concluded that the world has spent over $11 trillion in response, with an additional $10 trillion in lost future earnings. Still, this astronomical financial cost doesn't seem real to most of us. What we likely notice more than anything else is the isolation that COVID has brought on. Some of this through government mandates, and others are self-imposed. The NIH and common sense point out that social relationships are a fundamental component of human life, and that social isolation holds potential implications for their health and well-being. Several articles have popped up over this last year pointing to another epidemic that is on the horizon, another one that we are also not yet prepared for, and this is the epidemic of clinical depression. Unfortunately, we have already seen this played out with suspected suicide attempts amongst adolescents, the average of which has jumped up 39 to 50% depending on who we're looking at. The U.S. Census Bureau recently reported that a third of Americans also show signs of clinical depression and anxiety. COVID has already caused and will unfortunately continue to cause suffering, and for an unfortunate number of people, even death. But like Dostoevsky argues, beauty can be found in suffering, and beauty can save the world. We can look for the beauty in our world as a result of these terrible costs. We can look to Kierkegaard and Climacus and how we should relate to this isolation instead of falling into the grips of despair and anxiety. For Kierkegaard, there is indeed an upside to despair. Despair is necessary, it is the consciousness of sin, and it is the prerequisite for repentance. And in anxiety, there is a selfish infinity of the possibility. Kierkegaard's solution to the sins of the public sphere is to create silence. One must first create silence, retreat from the mob, and find God in seclusion. Yet this is not the same isolation that many of us find ourselves in during the era of COVID. Instead, for Kierkegaard, seclusion was found in temporary retreats, while often still being socially engaged, not distanced. For Kierkegaard, there are two models of the silent individual that stand above the rest. These are the two that we should venture to emulate. The first is Socrates, and the second is Christ, both of which were always surrounded by other people. Since religiousness B, he also points out, is fulfilled in relation to something that is outside of the individual, salvation is found not in the individual, but in community. Community and the crowd are two separate ideas. The community is made up of individuals who encounter one another and who ideally would love one another as an expression of genuine Christianity. Silence in a community is also what St. John of the Ladder recommends. In step 8 of the Ladder of Divine Ascent, on freedom from anger and on meekness, he tells us that when for some reason I was sitting outside of a monastery near the cells of those living in solitude, I heard them fighting by themselves in their cells like caged partridges from bitterness and anger, and leaping at the face of their offender as if he was actually present. And I devoutly advise them not to stay in solitude lest they change from human beings into demons. And I have also observed that people who are sensual and corrupt in heart are sometimes meek and what you might call flatterers, familiar, fond of outward show. And I advise these to go and adopt a life of solitary, using this as a cure for sensuality and corruption of heart, lest from rational beings they should be pitifully changed into irrational animals. But when some of them told me that they were the wretched victims of these two passions, anger and sensuality, I forbade them to live according to their own will, but in a friendly way I suggested to their superiors that they should allow them to sometimes live in one way and sometimes to live in another way of life, but that they should be entirely subject to the superior. Climacus adds a third thing to these requirements that Kierkegaard mentioned of silence and community, that we need a guide, we need a superior. We need somebody who can help you know if you need a little more seclusion, not isolation, but seclusion, or if you need less, if you need to be urged to surround yourself with people. We need somebody that will point out that you're going to become a demon or an irrational beast if you go too far one direction or another. And of course, this means you need community, all the more. In that community, somebody needs to have authority and help guide you along that way. Great events could come upon us and catch us intellectually unprepared. This is precisely what has happened. Indeed, they have, and how we should proceed is not to simply be isolated from those around us, But while we might retreat and gain some sort of silence and solitude, we're creating silence in this while still being engaged with a community. We also should probably take from St. John the Latter that we do need a guide, somebody who can urge us into the right measure that we should take this, and hopefully help us to climb that ladder to find faith, hope, and love. Thank you.